Erin Kennedy here with Evan New, and today we're talking tech. In today's biggest headline, Apple sold 9 million iPhones on the debut weekend of the iPhone 5S and the 5C. Evan, this is a huge number. Investors were expecting anywhere from 5 to 7 million. What do you make of this?
9 million is a very solid number. I think all investors are very impressed. Stock is up at least 5% in trading today. But I think there's also some additional context that you have to look at, is that this 9 million figure includes two different models, whereas all prior years it's only been the one flagship high-end model. So they're not directly comparable. I think there's good news because the 5S is constrained, so most of that is actually part of the 5C, which the 5C probably sold about as well as the 5 did last year, which is a pretty good news considering it's a lower cost device, will benefit margins.
Okay, Evan, you also you mentioned that there's two different phone models. Do they happen to break out the numbers for which sold how many?
They did not break out product mix, which Apple generally doesn't. But at the same time, we know that the 5S is constrained because the online shipping times slipped to October, like the very next day, whereas the 5C is currently still available. So I think it's safe to say that most of that is weighted towards the 5C. And it's also good news that Apple kind of raised their guidance in addition.
You mentioned Apple raised their guidance and as well as gross margin. Despite that, are you concerned at all about the fact that there is a lot more of the 5C in the mix? Because it does have a lower average selling price.
It does, which could put some downward pressure on the selling prices, but at the same time could also put higher pressure on the gross margin side. So they are guiding toward the high end of revenue and gross margin. So revenue should be close to 37 billion, which is good because that's above consensus, and everyone loves to follow consensus estimates, which I think is about 36.1 or 0.2 billion right now. Gross margin should be upwards of 37%. So those are two very encouraging pieces of news for investors coming into the quarter, especially with this launch only has about 10 days until the quarter ends, so it's already showing a good benefit for the September quarter. Yeah,
investors are clearly happy about it. Shares are up about 5% this morning. All right, in our next headline, Google is making the Quick Office Suite free. It's a mobile productivity app. We saw Apple do a similar thing lately. They just made iWork free for all iOS devices. Who should be worried here? Who's threatened by this move?
I think the big potential loser here is Microsoft. Microsoft has really shied away from a mobile version of Office that's really mainstream. It released Office for iOS earlier this year, but it was only available to Office 365 subscribers. It wasn't something you could just buy on your own for an upfront fee. They're really trying to promote their subscription model. But now here you have Apple coming in with iWork for iOS free. Google has Quick Office for free, so that's two pretty strong alternatives that are available for nothing for mobile productivity. Kind of questions the ability of Microsoft. Can they actually make a mobile version and sell it? Like, who's going to pay for it when you can just get this other stuff for free that's pretty strong too?
But when you're talking about the threat to Microsoft, aren't we really looking at Microsoft more as an enterprise? Like, that's their customer for 365, isn't it?
That's totally true. And Office is their most profitable segment, and the majority of the business division is or what used to be the business division under their old structure. The most of that was very much toward enterprise sales. So the iWork and Quick Office are much more geared towards the consumer level, which is not a huge threat to Microsoft's business, but at the same time, Google Apps for Business is targeting that enterprise section. So Apple probably is never going to target the enterprise segment with productivity software too aggressively, but Google probably will.
All right, gonna have to keep an eye on that. Let's look at the week ahead. The biggest storyline we're going to be looking at this week is BlackBerry earnings. Last Friday, BlackBerry released a preliminary report on earnings, and it was grim. They'll be reporting the full report this coming Friday, but shares sold off 17%. Evan, what can we expect?
Well, they gave all the big high-level data points that investors are looking for. We know revenue's not going to be good. They're going to post an operating loss. They wrote off about $1 billion in Z10 inventory, and they did specify that most of that write-off was the Z10. They said they sold about 3.8 million smartphones, most of which were BlackBerry 7 units, acknowledging that BlackBerry 10 devices are not selling through. Really a terrible release for investors all around. There's a couple of unknowns still. And they said that BlackBerry 10 sales are not good, but investors are going to want to know how bad they were. They're really going to want to look for how many actual units sold. Last quarter, they said about 40% of smartphones were BlackBerry 10, so that figure may be going down. In addition, we want to look at subscriber figures. last quarter, subscribers fell about 4 million to 72 million. And that's a pretty important gauge of how healthy BlackBerry's user base is. So we're gonna have to see if that number goes down, which it probably will, but by how much?
So you mentioned the Z10, near $1 billion write-down for Z10 devices. Just last week, they announced the Z30. I mean, what are they expecting for this new phone?
Well, the problem with the Z10, or one of the problems, was that it was priced really high. Here's BlackBerry coming back in with the Z10, and they need to make a big splash, and they price it at the way high end of the market. And that pricing affects its inventory valuation. And then now, when it doesn't sell, they have to write down this huge gap between what they can sell for now, because they've repositioned the Z10 as this more entry-level device, and that's where this write-down is coming from. But yeah, I mean, where they price the Z10 or the Z30 is going to be a big indication of whether or not it can sell. They're also pulling out of the consumer market. Really, not a lot of good news here for BlackBerry investors.
Plus the layoffs announced last week as well.
Yeah, 40% that were rumored and then confirmed.
It's going to be another rough week for BlackBerry. Let's move on to Rumor Mill Monday. There are reports that Google is set to release the new Nexus 5 phone in October. It'll be running Android 4.4 KitKat. What do you make of this news, Evan?
So the interesting part about this is that LG is reportedly making the Nexus 5. That contrasts directly with previous statements that LG executives had said about they're not really interested in making Nexus devices anymore because the incentive structure is kind of misaligned. But the rumors show that they actually might be doing it. 5-inch display has a Qualcomm Snapdragon processor in it, pretty high-end specs. But again, like all Nexus devices before it, Google is targeting the mid-range price segment in order to make it appealing or approachable and affordable to the unsubsidized and prepaid markets, particularly in emerging economies.
So why does Google keep going with LG? If LG seems hesitant, Google bought Motorola. They just released the X phone. Why do they continue this relationship with LG when they could just bring it in-house?
That's a pretty good point, because Moto X and Nexus are very similar in terms of how they're positioned strategically. They're both mid-range devices, they both have pretty decent specs, and they're both stock Android, or mostly stock in the case of Moto X. So it does kind of beg the question of why do you need two different distinct devices? But at the same time, Google might not have very many choices with Nexus phones, because Samsung and HTC probably don't want anything to do with it. They have their own Google editions. And at the same time, if they partner even more closely with Moto X or with Motorola generally, there's that fine line there trying to balance between annoying all their other OEMs and working with their own in-house OEM now. So I don't think they can really have Motorola create a Nexus phone for them without causing too many shockwaves in the Android industry.
All right, our next rumor is the Apple iPad event. It's being reported that it's scheduled for October 15th. We're expecting to see a redesign for the full-size iPad, probably a Retina screen for the iPad mini. What else do you expect from this?
Well, I think that there's a lot of hardware among Apple's lineup that needs to be updated. And last year, they kind of updated them all at the same October event. So we're talking MacBooks. Maybe the new Mac Pro will be announced that they teased earlier this year. Maybe some Apple TV set-top box refreshers. A bunch of refreshing throughout the lineup. But as far as the iPad's concerned, that's probably, what you mentioned is probably going to be the extent of it. New iPad 5s. There's been a lot of conflicting reports on the Retina iPad mini. So we'll have to wait and see if they have anything else up their sleeves, like Touch ID.
What do you expect from Touch ID? Would you expect that to be in the mini or the full-size iPad?
I'm really not sure at this point. There hasn't been a lot of rumors to suggest one way or the other. But at the same time, with them just debuting Touch ID in the iPhone 5s, and Apple likes to kind of roll out their features to as many devices as they can. So it makes sense to inevitably bring it to the iPad. But the flip side is that there's reportedly constraints around these Touch ID sensors, and if they're facing constraints, Apple's probably better allocating those sensors to the iPhone 5s, which is a higher margin, high-end product, whereas putting it in the iPad, maybe when yields improve and they can afford to move some supply over, maybe not this year, but I think eventually they will put Touch ID in iOS devices throughout, maybe next year.
All right, well, for Evan New, I'm Erin Kennedy, and we'll see you tomorrow.